This is a 2014 Audi RS7. It is a 4-year-old all-wheel drive super sedan hatchback thing with 560 horsepower. It does 0 to 60 in 3.9 seconds. It looks just like a brand new model, and it's half price. This one is for sale for just under $73,000. The average asking price on AutoTrader for a brand new RS7 is just over $140,000. So today I'm going to show you why a used RS7 is such a good deal. Now, I borrowed this RS7 from Motor Cars of the Main Line, an excellent dealership here in the Philadelphia suburbs with a seemingly unending inventory of interesting, cool, weird, and unusual cars. I chose to check out the RS7 because it seems like exactly the kind of car that I would like. A nice, practical hatchback with a roomy, luxurious, well-appointed luxury car interior, and 560 horsepower. Admittedly, 560 horsepower is a lot, too much to really use. And this car's new price is a lot too. The average asking price $140,000. The sticker price on this one was $125,000 when it was new just 4 years ago. But now used RS7 models are starting to get cheaper. Motor Cars of the Main Line is asking $72,950 for this one. That's about the going rate for a used RS7, and that's sort of Mercedes-Benz E-Class and BMW 5 Series money, except this one has 560 horsepower. So today I'm going to show you around the RS7, and I'm going to show you all of its interesting quirks and features, and then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. And for more of my thoughts on the RS7, click the link below to visit autotrader.com/oversteer, where I've also compiled a list of certified pre-owned German super sedans and sports cars listed for sale on AutoTrader for a fraction of their original price with manufacturer warranties. Now I'm going to start with the quirks and features on the outside. I want to talk very briefly about the styling of this car. I'm not the biggest fan of how the A7 looks. I know a lot of people are, but I'm not. But I do like how subtle this is for a performance car. In the days of M cars having orange brake calipers and AMG cars having giant front mouths that make them look like a big fish, RS cars from Audi are some of the subtlest high-performance cars on the road. And I love subtle high-performance cars. If you didn't know this thing had 560 horsepower because you were a car enthusiast, you would never guess. This is a sleeper. All those other cars are just trying a little bit too hard in terms of styling. With that said, I think this car does have a few cool styling touches worth noting, one of which is the taillights. I've always liked the taillights in the A7, the S7, the RS7. It has this sort of U shape that sort of revolves throughout the taillight. It is a really cool looking design and way better than a normal boring taillight. And since I'm back here, one other interesting thing about the RS7 is the fact that it is a hatchback. Now, this won't come as a surprise to any car enthusiast. Most of us know that the A7 is a hatchback, but it is worth pointing out because this car's main competitors, the BMW M5, the Mercedes E63, they're sedans. And so this being a hatchback is a lot more roomy and more practical if you actually want to carry stuff around in your 560 horsepower car. And you can see if you look in there, it is pretty big. Now, it is roomy back here, roomy enough that this is where Audi places the owner's manual. Instead of the glove box, there's a little net back here where they keep it. You open up the owner's manual and you will find, of course, a few interesting quirks. One of which is the fact that this is the owner's manual for English, and yet it says on the spine English spelled in German. Same with the infotainment system owner's manual, English North America. So even though they gave us the English owner's manual, they translated the word English into German, which seems a little bit unusual. Now, opening up the owner's manual, you will also find a couple of interesting quirks. I'm going to start on page 128. There's a section about riding in the vehicle properly, and it says, no persons or animals should ride in the footwell. That makes sense. But right after persons, it says in parentheses, children, reminding you that children are people. So if you had any concerns about that, you can check your Audi owner's manual. Not just automotive information in here, folks, life information. Audi considers children to be people. You heard it here first on the Doug DeMuro YouTube channel. Our next interesting item is on page 208. When Audi is talking about what fuel to use, it says unleaded gasoline is available throughout the USA, Canada, and in most European countries. Most. Are there some European countries that don't offer unleaded gasoline? Are there countries in Europe that only they still have leaded gasoline? Or maybe is this just something Audi wrote in about 1983 and no one has bothered to update it since then because no one has bothered to read it? Another interesting item back here is the rear wing, which you can see is in its up position. To get it there, you push a little button inside the cabin in the center control stack, and then the wing sort of whirs automatically into place so you can show off your RS7 just a little bit more with the wing up if you so desire. And speaking of buttons, this car has a lot of buttons. In fact, you could consider this car's theme to be buttons, many of which you won't find on virtually any other car. Of course, I'm going to show them all to you, and I'm going to start with the driver's door panel. This car has child locks. Many cars do. You can lock the rear doors from the driver's seat so that your kids can't open the doors while you're driving. The interesting thing about this car is it has individual child locks. So if you have grandma sitting on one side in the back and your 3-year-old sitting on the other, you can lock the 3-year-old's child lock, and you can leave grandma's unlocked so she can get in and out of the car whenever she wishes. It's a really smart idea you don't see on that many cars. Another great idea, this car has a memory off button. Allow me to explain. Most luxury cars have a thing where you can set a memory seating position so that every time you get in the car, if it was adjusted slightly by another driver, it goes back to your desired position. It's a good idea in theory, but if you're borrowing a friend's car, you get in, the seat goes to his position, you adjust it to your position, then you go out to the grocery store, you come back, turn the car on, and it adjusts back to his position, and it can get annoying. So this car has a button on the door panel to just turn it off. It's a really smart idea. I've never seen in any other car. You can just turn it off so the seat doesn't keep adjusting back to your friend's position every time you get in. Then when you give the car back to your friend, you just turn memory off back on, and then the seat goes back to its desired settings. You don't have to deal with it every time. It's brilliant. And another interesting button on the driver's door panel. This car has blind spot monitoring. It lets you know if a car is in your blind spot so you don't accidentally change lanes into another car. Usually turning on and off blind spot monitoring is hidden in some infotainment settings screen, but in this car, it's just a little button on the door panel. You push it and it turns it off, or you push it and it turns it back on. It's very simple, and I feel like virtually everybody else should do that. Next up, moving inside to check out the rest of the buttons, we must start with a button to the left of the headlight switch that has like a moon on it. That button turns on the night vision system inside the gauge cluster. I love night vision systems, but I especially love using them during the day because it makes the entire world look like some dystopian future where the only thing that survived is you and your RS7. Just look at how this looks. Anyway, the theory of the night vision system is it aids you on really dark roads. It even points out pedestrians you may not be able to see in pitch black. Another button over there is one that has a headlight on it with like a cloud. That's the fog light button, which I absolutely love. In a lot of cars with front and rear fog lights, it's hard to tell which is the front fog light and which is the rear fog light, so Audi redesigned their front fog light button to add the cloud to make it a little bit more obvious. The rear fog light button is down below, and it has sort of the more traditional fog light button design. Our next button worthy of mentioning is actually a dial. It's to the right of the headlight switch, and it's this little silver dial, and above it there's a picture of a steering wheel and a windshield, which seems a little bit cryptic. That actually raises and lowers the heads-up display. As you tilt it, the heads-up display goes up or down depending on your level of preference. Next up, maybe a little bit more unusual, is the button on the steering wheel that looks like an asterisk or maybe a star or perhaps a snowflake. That button is sort of like a wild card button. You can program it to do a lot of different vehicle functions, so you can have it right at your thumb. For example, if you want a next track button on the steering wheel, you can program it to do that, and you have the next track. It's sort of like speed dial for your vehicle functions. It's a good idea, and I think a lot of people would like to have maybe 3 or 4 of those wild card buttons. Next up, less of a button and more of a pad. Take a look at this little black pad in the center console, and now take a look what happens when I turn the car on. Those numbers are your radio presets, 1 through 6. You can just tap them, and then it goes to that radio station. Turn the car back off, and it just becomes a black pad again with no apparent function until the car is running. That is kind of a cool little feature. Another button allows you to change the climate controls in an interesting way. Take a look at the climate controls where they are. You can just see there are 2 dials, but they adjust the temperature. So how do you adjust the amount of air that comes out? Well, you push a little fan button, and then those dials convert to becoming the amount of air that's coming out. You push the fan again, and they go back to being your temperature controls, etc. So that little fan button changes the function of the little dials, which is kind of cool, and yet another task assigned to a button in this car. And if you thought you were sick of hearing hearing me say buttons, there's still more. To the left of the center climate controls, there is an unusually large button to zero out the odometer. I'm not sure why that's so big. Right above that, there's a button with sort of a cryptic look on it. That button raises or lowers the infotainment screen. Take a look, you push it, and the infotainment screen not only goes down, but sort of slides backwards into its home, so it doesn't appear that there's any screen at all, and the dashboard has a cleaner look. And speaking of retractable things, there are several interesting things that retract and extend when the car is turned on. For example, this one has the optional Bang & Olufsen sound system. You turn it on, and the speakers rise out of the dashboard to give you a better sound experience. When you turn the car off, the speakers go back into the dashboard for a more flush, cleaner look. Also, when you turn the car on, that infotainment screen rises out of the center console and pops up to give you all of the screen items you might need, and of course you can put it away if you want to. And when you turn the car on, the speedometer and tachometer needles max out and then go back to zero. That's pretty common, but I really like how they do it. They have these little red lights that light up when they max out, and then they unlight when they go back to zero, and it's a much cooler look than just watching the needles rise and fall. Now, next up, I want to talk about the materials in this car. I'm not especially in love with Audi, and I don't especially dislike them. I'm sort of neutral, but I have to admit, as a casual observer, the materials in this car are absolutely beautiful. First off, I love the black trim with the white stripes. It just looks gorgeous. It's on the door panels, the center console, the dashboard, and it's even on this little area under the windshield that sort of extends throughout the entire car and meets in the middle in this arrow pattern. It is a beautiful look. Then you have the seats, which have these cool white stitched hexagons in them. They just look really, really nice. And then there's the steering wheel, which feels tight and well stitched, and these little holes make it easy to grip and cool, and it seems like a sports car, race car steering wheel. You look around and everything is just well built, well placed, and when you touch it, it feels good. Next up, moving into the rear seat, where headroom is actually surprisingly decent. I can sit up back here and my head just barely touches the ceiling, which is pretty good considering this car's sort of sloping coupe roofline and considering my height. I'm 6'3". Now, there aren't many quirks in the back, but there are a couple of interesting ones, one of which is the fact that the door panels contain ashtrays. That's an interesting quirk because there are no ashtrays in front, none. I'm going to prove that to you by showing you all of the front storage compartments. Here's 1, 2, 3, and 4. None of those are ashtrays, but there are 2 ashtrays in back. I think it's a case of Audi not really being sure what else to put on the door panel, so they're like, yeah, why not go with ashtrays? A couple of other interesting rear quirks. One is that there's only 2 seats back here, so just like the Porsche Panamera, this is a 4-seat vehicle and not a 5-seater. The other interesting thing is the rear passengers have a lock button on their door. They can lock the doors, but there's no unlock button. So their only option, they can lock them, but once they've locked them, they better be committed to locking them because there's no way to unlock them again. Next up, moving back into the front to discuss the quirks and features of this car's screens. I'm going to start with the screen in the gauge cluster. Now, this car isn't new enough to have the Audi virtual cockpit, the full screen that some of the newer models have, but it still has a fairly configurable screen. I do like the fact that the fuel range is always displayed up there, sort of like your phone always displaying the battery percentage. It tells you exactly how many miles till empty and it doesn't go away, and that is a good idea. On the center screen, there are quite a few interesting quirks, one of which is under vehicle settings. You can set the air suspension for towing, which is kind of strange to me. Do you think a lot of people are towing with a 560 horsepower car? If they are, there is an option for it, and the air suspension can adapt to tow a trailer. Another interesting item in the infotainment system is interior lighting. You can choose how bright or dim you want the interior lights to be. The weird thing is, look how many options there are. It's almost unending. There's like 50 different pegs on this dial. You think people can really tell the difference between this and this? It makes no sense. Nonetheless, if you're especially particular about how dim or bright you want your interior lights to be, you can change it in that settings screen. Next up, an interesting feature is music volume while parking. This is a pretty good idea. You can set the system to lower the music to a certain volume if you're parking, so you can concentrate on parking in a tight space. The weird thing is, first off, again, there are a lot of different options for it, but second, listen to just how annoying it is when you're trying to set it. Ah, thank you, Audi, for those lovely sounds. That was wonderful. Next up, changing the rear climate controls from the front. This is very strange. If you want to change the rear climate temperature from the front, you go to the rear climate control screen, and then your front climate controls are adjusting the rear. So when you adjust the temperature in the front, it's actually changing it in back. When you get off the screen for the rear climate controls, then your front climate controls go back to being front climate controls. You go back into the screen and you can see that the temperature settings are different now in front than they were before. That's because they're now adjusting the rear. So you change it for the rear, you get out of the screen, and then it goes back to being your front climate controls. It's a very strange feeling adjusting the front climate controls, but you're actually adjusting the rear. And speaking of interesting settings, here's a strange one. There is a specific setting in the climate control settings for footwell temperature. And then you can change this dial to make your footwell temperature precisely how you want. It's very weird that footwell temperature specifically has its setting beyond the automatic climate control system, but it does, because in this car virtually everything seems to be configurable. Next up, go into vehicle info, and this car will tell you what your VIN number is in the screen. Notice I said VIN number. Well, so does Audi. It says VIN number, vehicle identification number. People are always getting on me for saying, well, that's redundant, you should just say VIN, but Audi says it too. Haha, I'm vindicated. Haha. And speaking of vehicle info, another item in that vehicle info screen, it tells you how many programmed keys your car has. So if you buy one of these used and you only get 2 keys and it says there are 3 programmed keys, you'll drive around for the rest of your life wondering. Next up, we move into the sound system settings and check this out. Balance fader. You can choose where in the car you want the sound to be centered on. This is common. Every car has this, but in this car, look what happens. The way you can control it is that pad that had the radio presets on it. So when you go into balance fader, that pad changes instantly to allow you to control where the sound is centered. And then you use the pad and it changes on the screen. When you're done changing the balance and the fader, you get out of there and then the pad goes back to being your radio presets instantly. That's a very cool piece of technology. It's very cool to see that thing change, and there's no indication it ever had any other function once it's changed to the next function. Next up, moving under the hood. Now, I'm always critical of cars with plastic engine covers that sort of take away your ability to see the actual engine, but I have to admit, if I was going to have any plastic engine cover, it would be this one. It is a very cool look, and I like the fact that they painted it red, even though most owners will lease this car and will probably never even bother to open the hood. You gotta admit that looks cool. Also interesting under here is that little warning label letting you know that reservoir gets hot. It looks like a thermometer that's kind of exploding. It's a stupid little graphic, but I admit it does get the point across. And so that's a tour of the RS7, and now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. Driving the RS7. Now, if my camera's a little shakier than usual, it's because I forgot my mount today and I had to use a backup. Now, when I reviewed the RS3, I noted that this car is great and cool and special, but it's too powerful. And one of the things I have come to terms with since driving this car is that that was simply not true. No, it is true. The car is too powerful, but the thing of it is, you don't have to go nuts. And I really don't like the car when it's $150,000 and too powerful, because then it's like you're spending all this money to get all this power you won't use. But when it starts to become $70-some thousand, it's like, well, that's almost RS3 money, and you get an extra couple hundred horsepower, so it's probably worth it. Wow. Yeah, it's got a lot of power. It really, really hauls. The handling is actually surprisingly good. I say surprising not because I'm surprised that Audi makes a car that handles well. It's more that I'm surprised that a car this large handles this well. And also, I always view sort of the A7, RS7, S7 cars as sort of like ultimately front all-wheel drive cars as opposed to like true rear-wheel drive chassis and platform, like an E63 or an S-Class or something like that. And so to me, it's surprising that it handles as well as it does. The steering is just barely a little bit vague, but very composed, reasonably precise. The car corner is very flat. It's fun to put it around corners. It shouldn't surprise me since it's an Audi RS car, but this car is more fun and more exciting than I was expecting it would be. I've always kind of discounted this car. I never really liked how the A7 looked. I know it's unusual. I think most people do like how it looks. But now I think with the RS7 upgrades, I kind of like the fact that they're relatively subtle upgrades as opposed to M cars with like blue brake calipers and stuff. And I think it ends up being reasonably cool. More so, I'm just impressed by how it drives. I love the feel of the steering wheel with these sort of like dots in the leather. Like it really feels like I'm really grabbing onto it, and then just around corners. It feels a lot smaller than it is put it around corners. It is excessive power. I mean, it simply doesn't need to be this fast. I don't think I would pay the $125 for this thing new, or the $140 as it were on a lot of the newer ones. but I would definitely start looking at this car pretty seriously at 70 or 75. It's obviously also a reasonably comfortable car. I'm actually surprised at how compliant and sort of plush the ride is. Going over bumps, it feels a little bit harsh, as sportier cars tend to with sportier suspension. But it isn't harsh, you know, difficult, beats you up by any means. It's certainly fun to drive when you want it to be, and it's a luxury car when you want it to be that also. In the end, I think it's easy to say that this is a very impressive car. It's an excellent car. It's built well. A lot of people think it looks good. I personally do not love the styling. It drives tremendously well. It handles very well. It's incredibly fast. My only gripe is with the cost from new. I mean, it's just ridiculous to pay $125,000 for 560 horsepower you'll never use, but for a car that's, you know, when it's only 3 years old and it still feels like a new car, drives like a new car, and then you're only paying $75,000, that's not quite as bad of a deal. That suddenly becomes the thing where you really have to kind of start considering it. And so that's the 2014 Audi RS7. It's hard to say a $75,000 car is a bargain, but this one has a lot of power, excellent performance, a lot of tech, and a lot of features for a huge discount compared to the new price. And now it's time to give it a Doug score. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, I like how the RS7 looks, but I know a lot of people love it. I'll compromise and give it a 7 out of 10. Acceleration does 0 to 60 in 3.7 seconds, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Handling is very good for a 4-door car, and it easily earns a 6 out of 10. Fun factor is strong, it's a blast to drive, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Cool factor is reasonably high. Most people don't know it's anything too special, but car people know it's something very special, and it gets a 6 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 34 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories, starting with features. The newest Audi models do well here, but the RS7 lacks some of the very latest technology, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Comfort is surprisingly good, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Quality is excellent. The interior is among the best I've ever seen, but I'm just not sure about long-term reliability. It gets an 8 out of 10. Practicality is good. It has an impressive 49 cubic feet of cargo space, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Finally, there's value. Used models like this one are a great value, worthy of an 8 maybe, but potential repair costs are troubling, and that bumps it down to a 6 out of 10 for a total daily score of 36 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 70 out of 100, which is near the top. Here's a comparison to similar cars. The E63 wagon rules this segment, but not by much. The Panamera Turbo falls just short with a lower weekend score. It simply isn't as much fun as its Audi RS7 rival.